Picture this. You walk into a highly veiled military briefing, crack a joke at someone's expense, and seconds later discover they're the reason you're still breathing. That's exactly what happened to one cocky admiral, and what followed changed everything he thought he knew about heroism. The Pacific Command Center's conference room gleamed with polished authority. Glass walls stretched from floor to ceiling, reflecting rows of military flags, while afternoon sunlight caught the glint of medals adorning every chest in the room. Oak furniture, leather chairs, the subtle hum of power. This wasn't just another meeting. This was where decisions affecting thousands of lives got made over coffee and classified reports. Around that massive table sat the military elite. Generals with decades of combat experience, admirals who'd commanded fleets across hostile waters, officers whose names appeared in textbooks. They'd gathered to hammer out details for an upcoming multinational exercise, the kind of operation that required perfect coordination between branches that didn't always see eye to eye. Among this sea of brass and battle-hardened faces sat someone different. Captain Elena Ward, an Air Force fighter pilot who looked too young, too composed, too calm for a room crackling with testosterone and ego. She'd been invited specifically for her aerial combat expertise, though most of the Navy officers present had never heard her name before today. The introductions crawled around the table with military precision. Name, rank, specialty. Repeat. Standard procedure. Boring as hell. Until they reached Admiral Jack Hollister. Now, Hollister was a character. His eyes locked onto Elena with the casual arrogance of someone who never met a challenge he could overcome. The room could feel what was coming. That particular energy shift that happens right before someone says something they think is clever. "So, Captain," he drawled, arms crossing over his chest, voice carrying that booming confidence that filled every corner of the room. Every hotshot pilot's got a call sign. What do they call you up there? Princess? Sunshine. Chuckles rippled through the assembled officers. A few hid smiles behind their hands. That uncomfortable laughter that happens when someone in authority makes a joke that's just barely appropriate. It was textbook hazing, the kind of casual disrespect that women in the military faced constantly, dressed up as humor so it could slide past official complaints. Elena didn't laugh. She didn't smile. She didn't blush or stammer or give Hollister the reaction he was fishing for. She simply looked at him with eyes that could have been carved from stone, her expression revealing absolutely nothing. The air conditioning seemed suddenly louder in the silence that followed. Hollister raised an eyebrow, still amused, still expecting her to either fire back with wit or shrink from his attention. Instead, when she spoke, her voice came out flat and cold, cutting through the room's atmosphere like a blade through silk. Iron Widow. 2 words. That's all it took. The laughter died like someone had flipped a switch. Chairs creaked as officers sat up straighter, suddenly attentive. Hollister's grin didn't just fade, it collapsed. Confusion flashing across his face before transforming into something else entirely. Disbelief. Recognition. Horror. The name hit him with physical force, like a punch he hadn't seen coming. His mind raced backward through classified reports and memories he'd tried to bury, landing on a night years ago when death had seemed absolutely certain until a voice cut through the radio static. A voice he'd never forgotten, attached to a pilot whose name had been erased from every official record. He stared at her, this calm woman in an Air Force uniform, suddenly uncertain whether this was real or some kind of elaborate, cruel joke. Because Iron Widow was dead. Iron Widow had been a ghost story for years, a legend whispered in classified briefing rooms, a myth that older operators told younger ones over drinks they'd never officially consumed. For several heartbeats, nobody moved. The air itself seemed to thicken, pressing down on everyone's lungs. The Admiral's smirk had vanished completely, replaced by an expression that cycled rapidly through shock, confusion, and dawning realization. Other officers glanced at each other, most of them lost, not understanding why the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped 20 degrees. But those who knew, those who'd served close enough to the darkest corners of special operations, their faces had gone pale. They understood exactly what that name meant. Hollister blinked hard, like he was trying to reset his vision, make sense of what he was seeing. His voice, usually so confident and commanding, came out strangling, caught somewhere between his throat and his chest. What? What did you say? Though the answer was already echoing in his skull, already pulling up memories he'd thought were safely buried. Elena's gaze remained steady, look at Denise, her eyes holding the same calculating calm that fighter pilots develop after years of making life-or-death decisions at supersonic speeds. Iron Widow, she repeated. Softer this time, but somehow even more impactful. It wasn't a boast, wasn't a challenge. It was simply a fact, stated plainly, the way you might tell someone your name or where you were born. A visible shiver passed through the room. Junior officers leaned toward each other, whispering urgently, sensing the tension but unable to grasp its source. One colonel muttered to his neighbor, voice barely audible, "That can't be the Iron Widow. She's a myth. She's been dead for years." But Hollister wasn't hearing any of it. His mind had already traveled backward through time, pulling up classified files and blood-soaked memories that he'd tried hard to forget. A desert airfield, under siege. A doomed extraction mission. A lone fighter jet that had materialized from nowhere, like an avenging angel. The name that intelligence officers had buried under so many classified stamps that it might as well have never existed. That name was now standing in front of him. Breathing. Human. Real. He opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. His hand, the same hand that had held steady under fire in a dozen combat zones, trembled slightly as he gripped the table's edge. The medals on his chest suddenly felt unbearably heavy, each one a reminder of the mission where he'd survived because of her. The mission where they'd told him she'd died. The laughter was gone. The arrogance was gone. The casual confidence that had defined him moments ago had evaporated completely. All that remained was silence, sharp and suffocating and reverent, as the legend he'd thought was long dead stared back at him across polished oak. Years earlier, before his rise to Admiral, before the medals and the authority and the comfortable office, Jack Hollister had led an elite SEAL unit deep into hostile territory, on an operation that would never make headlines, never appear in history books, never officially exist. The mission was codenamed Spectre Fall, a surgical strike to extract a captured intelligence officer from a heavily fortified compound, buried somewhere in endless desert. Everything had gone catastrophically wrong from the moment their boots hit sand. Their transport helicopter took fire and went down hard. Communications were jammed by equipment they hadn't expected the enemy to possess. An enemy aircraft, more sophisticated than intelligence had predicted, circled overhead like vultures waiting for prey to stop moving. The extraction team found themselves trapped, surrounded by hostile forces, outgunned and running low on ammunition. Hollister, experienced enough to know when odds were impossible, had accepted death that night. He could still remember the radio static, the screams of wounded men, the endless thunder of gunfire that seemed to come from every direction. Then a voice cut through all the chaos. Calm, crisp, almost mechanical in its precision. "This is Iron Widow. Hold your position." None of them knew who she was. The call sign wasn't in their mission file, wasn't in any database they could access. The SEALs didn't care about protocols or proper channels. They just clung to that voice like drowning men grabbing a lifeline, because it was the first thing that had sounded even remotely like hope in hours. Moments later, the night sky erupted with fire. A single fighter jet streaked through clouds, defying every radar system the enemy had deployed, performing maneuvers that should have been aerodynamically impossible. She tore through enemy air support with surgical precision, annihilating every aircraft that approached the compound. By dawn, against all probability, the SEALs were alive. All because of her. But when the dust settled and debriefings began, command reported that the pilot known only as Iron Widow had never returned to base. Her jet had vanished from radar minutes after the final strike. Classified reports, stamped with enough security clearances to make them effectively invisible, claimed she'd gone down in enemy territory. Lost. Presumably dead. Hollister had watched the official debriefing in silence, jaw clenched, as they stamped the case file, top secret, and buried it under layers of redacted documents. The name Iron Widow became a ghost story in military circles after that. A whispered legend of a pilot who'd given her life to save a dozen men she'd never met. Men whose names she'd never learned. And now, years later, she was standing before him. Not a phantom, not a myth, not a name in a classified file. Flesh and blood and very much alive. The realization hit him with staggering, overwhelming force. The woman he'd thought of as an angel of death, as a tragic hero who'd made the ultimate sacrifice, was real. She'd saved his life, pulled him and his team back from the edge of death, and then the government had systematically erased her from existence. Hollister's pulse hammered in his ears as that truth crashed down on him. She wasn't just another officer at this briefing. She was his savior. The reason he'd lived long enough to earn all those medals, to rise through the ranks, to sit in this conference room making jokes at her expense. The irony was almost too brutal to process. Admiral Hollister's breath came in short, shallow gasps. His chest felt constricted, like someone had wrapped steel cables around his ribs. His eyes swept over Elena, searching desperately for proof, for some physical confirmation of what his gut already knew with absolute certainty. A gesture. Anything that would bridge the gap between the voice he remembered from that desert night and the woman standing calmly before him. She stood perfectly still, hands clasped behind her back in parade rest, her uniform crisp and immaculate. Her face revealed nothing, a mask of professional composure. But in her eyes, those sharp, calculating fighter pilot's eyes, he saw it, the same fire he'd glimpsed through grainy cockpit video feeds years ago. The same unwavering calm that had spoken through radio static while hell burned all around them. The conference room had gone utterly still. Several high-ranking officers began whispering among themselves, curiosity morphing into unease. As they watched their admiral's reaction, something was happening, something significant, but most of them couldn't grasp what. Hollister pushed back from the table abruptly. His chair screeched against the polished floor, the harsh sound cutting through the heavy silence. Several people flinched at the noise. "That's impossible," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. His voice carried traces of desperation, like he was trying to convince himself this couldn't be real. "You were declared killed in action. I read the report myself, signed off on the condolence letters." Elena didn't flinch, didn't show any visible reaction to his words. When she spoke, her voice remained quiet, but carried clearly through the room. "Reports can lie, Admiral," she said simply, "especially when the truth makes someone uncomfortable." Her words landed like bullets, each one finding its mark. Several officers exchanged startled looks. The implications were staggering. Official reports had been falsified. A hero had been erased, and they were all sitting in a room where that uncomfortable truth was now impossible to ignore. Hollister stared at her, his face draining of color. "Why?" The word came out broken, almost pleading. "Why didn't anyone tell me? Why did they bury your name?" For the first time, Elena's mask cracked slightly. A faint, humorless smile touched her lips, gone almost before it fully formed. "Because a story about a pilot disobeying direct orders to save a ground team doesn't make for good propaganda," she explained, her voice carrying an edge of bitter experience. "They needed a ghost, not a hero. Clean narratives are easier to manage than messy truths." Understanding washed over Hollister in a cold wave. The classified seals, the abrupt end to debriefings, the way questions about the mysterious pilot had been deflected and dismissed. He'd believed she'd been lost in wreckage. A tragic sacrifice, but the truth was darker, more calculated. Command had erased her deliberately, branded her actions as insubordination to protect their image. to avoid awkward questions about why orders had been wrong and why breaking them had been necessary. Elena's composure wavered for just a moment. "I wasn't supposed to survive," she said softly, her gaze distant. "After the crash, I was recovered by locals, stayed off-grid for months while I healed. When I finally made it back, they told me the file was closed, that Iron Widow had died. So I let her. It was easier that way." The Admiral's throat tightened painfully. The weight of guilt and realization was physically crushing him. He'd worn medals for that mission, had been promoted partly because of its success, honor that she had earned with blood and fire and courage, while she'd been forced to disappear, to let her legend die so the official story could remain clean. His legs felt weak. He gripped the table's edge for support, knuckles white. "My God," he whispered, the words barely audible. "It was you all along." The truth tore through Admiral Hollister like shrapnel. His body seemed to lose all tension at once, sagging as if every secret, every medal, every false report had suddenly materialized as physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. This proud Navy SEAL, this man who'd faced death on foreign soil without flinching, now sat trembling before the very person whose existence his world had systematically erased. He pressed both hands to his face, trying desperately to steady his breathing, but memories crashed into him in violent, overwhelming waves. The flames over the desert, the radio static, her voice telling him to hold position, steady and calm while his world burned. He remembered shouting into the comms, begging command to identify the pilot who'd saved them, and being told curtly that it was classified need to know only, and he didn't need to know. He remembered watching her fighter vanish from radar, remembered the sick feeling in his gut, remembered believing he'd somehow failed to save her the way she'd saved him. Now, sitting across from her, breathing the same air, he realized she'd been carrying the weight of his survival all along. Alone. Erased. Forgotten by everyone except the ghosts she'd saved. The officers in the room didn't know what to do. The atmosphere had shifted from military formality to something raw and painful and deeply personal. No one dared speak. Even the most senior commanders recognized they were witnessing something that transcended rank and protocol. The Admiral's chest heaved as his carefully constructed composure cracked completely. He looked at Elena again, really looked at her, seeing past the uniform to the person beneath. His voice emerged trembling with disbelief and something close to anguish. "They let me think you died," he said, each word heavy with betrayal. "They gave me commendations, promoted me. All this time, I've been saluted for your heroism." Elena's eyes softened fractionally, though her face remained composed. That quiet grace, that absence of bitterness or anger, shattered him completely. He tried to respond, but his voice failed. His hands slipped from his face and fell to the table, trembling uncontrollably. Sweat formed across his forehead. His breathing quickened, becoming shallow and irregular. The reality of it all, the guilt, the loss, the shame, the sheer weight of knowing he'd built part of his career on her buried sacrifice. It was too much. The room blurred around him. His vision narrowed to a tunnel. A dull ringing filled his ears, drowning out everything else. Then, with a gasp that caught everyone off guard, Admiral Hollister's body went rigid. His eyes rolled back, and he collapsed to the floor. Chaos erupted instantly. Chairs scraped back in panic. Officers shouted for medical assistance. A Navy corpsman rushed forward, dropping to his knees beside the fallen admiral. Others crowded around, creating a wall of bodies and concern. Elena didn't move immediately. She stood frozen, watching the man who'd mocked her minutes ago, now crumpled by the weight of her name, felled not by enemy fire, but by truth. Only when someone called directly for help did she step forward, her movements calm and measured despite the pandemonium. She knelt beside him, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. The corpsman worked frantically, checking vitals, loosening his collar, speaking urgently into a radio. Through it all, Elena remained still, an island of calm in the storm. The Admiral's eyes fluttered open. For the briefest second, before full consciousness returned, he looked at her with perfect clarity. but as the ghost who'd come back to set the record straight, to reclaim a name that had been stolen from her. When Admiral Hollister regained full consciousness, the room had quieted again, but this time, the silence carried a different quality. Not confusion, not discomfort. Respect. The heavy, reverent kind that settles over people when they realize they're witnessing something historically significant. A medic crouched beside him, shining a penlight in his eyes, checking pupil response. Hollister brushed the hand away with more force than necessary, pushing himself upright through sheer stubbornness. His pride was bruised, his uniform disheveled, but there was clarity in his gaze now, and something else rarely seen in men of his rank. Genuine humility. Elena stood several feet away, arms folded neatly behind her back, poster a parade ground. Perfect. Her expression remained unreadable, a mask of professional composure. She didn't approach him, didn't offer platitudes or comfort. She simply waited, her presence solid and unwavering. The Admiral steadied himself against the table's edge, his breathing still ragged. When he spoke, his voice came out hoarse, rough with emotion he couldn't quite suppress. "Captain Ward," he began. The title, carrying weight it hadn't held before. He paused, swallowed hard. Or should I say, Iron Widow. The words hung in the air like a confession, like an acknowledgement of sins he hadn't known he'd committed. Every eye in the room turned to him. Some of the younger officers still looked lost, unable to piece together what was happening. Others were wide-eyed as understanding dawned. Hollister slowly straightened, squaring his shoulders despite the tremor in his limbs. Then he did something no one expected, something that broke every rule of military protocol and hierarchy. He stepped forward, came to rigid attention before her, and raised his hand in a sharp "Deliberet salute." The gasp that rippled through the room was almost audible. Generals stood reflexively. Commanders froze mid-breath. The gesture shattered protocol completely. A superior officer saluting a subordinate was unheard of, wrong according to every regulation in the book. But there was no mistaking why he did it. This wasn't about rank anymore. This was about truth, about honor, about recognizing a debt that could never truly be repaid. Elena hesitated, her eyes glimmering faintly in the fluorescent light. Then, slowly, with the same measured precision that defined all her movements, she returned the salute. Crisp, steady. For the first time since the meeting began, she allowed herself to exhale fully. Hollister's voice trembled slightly as he spoke again, louder this time, ensuring everyone in the room could hear every word. Years ago, a mission called Spectre Fall went sideways. His voice grew stronger as he continued. My team should have died there. We survived because of a pilot who defied direct orders to save our lives. Command erased her name, buried her file under classified stamps, and let us all believe she died saving us. That pilot stands before you now. Murmurs spread through the assembled officers like a tide, but no one dared interrupt. Hollister's gaze never left Elena's face. She's not a myth. She's not a ghost story told over drinks. She's the reason I'm standing here. She's the reason 12 good men went home to their families. His voice dropped, raw, with emotion. And I'll be damned if her name stays buried another day. The words hit like a declaration, like a line drawn in the sand. Not against an enemy, but against the silence and bureaucracy that had swallowed her legacy. Several officers stood to attention instinctively, responding to the gravity of the moment, as though witnessing something sacred. Elena's composure finally wavered. Her jaw tightened. Her eyes flickered with emotion she'd kept buried for years, feelings she'd had to suppress to survive. She gave the Admiral a small nod. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acknowledgement. Recognition that he understood now, that the truth was finally, irrevocably, out. The ghost had been unmasked. The legend of Iron Widow was no longer a secret whispered in classified corridors or told as an impossible story by old operators. It was a name restored, spoken with the honor it had always deserved. When the meeting officially adjourned, nobody moved for several long moments. The air felt different now, charged with something intangible. The officers who'd entered expecting another routine briefing had witnessed something far more profound. the resurrection of a forgotten hero. As Elena turned to leave, several younger pilots instinctively stepped aside, creating a path. Their eyes followed her with quiet awe, the kind of reverence usually reserved for people you've only read about in history books. She didn't acknowledge the attention, didn't smile or pause. She simply walked with that same steady calm she'd carried into the room, the same calm that had once steadied a platoon of dying men under heavy fire. Admiral Hollister watched her go, his throat tight with 1,000 words he couldn't quite form. He wanted to apologize properly, to thank her, to tell her how her courage had haunted him through every promotion, every commendation, every quiet moment when he'd wondered if he'd truly earned his success. But he understood she didn't need to hear it. Her silence said enough. She hadn't come for recognition or validation, only for truth. Outside, brilliant sunlight spilled across the base runway, gleaming off the silver wings of waiting aircraft. Elena paused, breathing in the familiar scent of jet fuel mixed with ocean wind. Somewhere in the distance, a formation of fighters roared across the sky, their contrails crossing like white scars against endless blue. She lifted her gaze to watch them, allowing herself a rare, faint smile. The legend of Iron Widow had been buried beneath lies and convenient bureaucracy for years. But now she was free. Her name belonged to her again. Back inside the conference room, Admiral Hollister stood before the assembled officers, still visibly shaken but resolute. His voice carried clearly through the space. "Let it be officially recorded," he said quietly, but firmly, that Captain Elena Ward, call sign Iron Widow, is to be formally commended for extraordinary valor. She's saved lives when others failed to act, when the system failed, when orders would have left good men to die. As his words echoed through the chamber, the officers rose to their feet one by one, a wave of respect spreading through the room until every person stood in silent salute. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't required. It was simply the right thing to do. Outside, Elena approached her waiting jet, running one hand along its fuselage. Smooth, cold, alive beneath her touch. The engines hummed quietly, as if recognizing their pilot, as if they'd been waiting for her return. For a brief moment, she glanced back toward the glass-walled conference room. Through the reflection, she could see Admiral Hollister standing at the window, watching her. Their eyes met across the distance, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. Soldier and savior, both changed by truth. Then, without another word or gesture, she climbed into the cockpit. The jet roared to life, tearing down the runway with gathering speed before lifting into the blazing afternoon sky. The Iron Widow, reborn and restored, soaring once more into the clouds that had once been meant to be her grave. And as she disappeared into the horizon, even Admiral Hollister couldn't help but whisper with reverence and genuine awe, "Welcome back, Widow." The legend was dead, but the woman was very much alive.